Good morning, everybody. I don't have a PowerPoint, and I know historians are often criticized for not, why don't you have a PowerPoint? But actually, I usually do, but there wasn't, this talk didn't lend itself as much to images except for the pictures we've all seen 100 times of Russell and Burch, so you'll have to bear with me. Now, as you all know, the beginnings of a kind of formal alternative movements based on the 3 R's can be traced back to a project that was sponsored by the university's Federation for Animal Welfare, UFAW, and which resulted in the publication, of course, of the book that we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of now, and that is The Principles of Humane Experimental Techniques. Now, UFAW, and I apologize for those of you who know a lot of this history already, but I don't think everyone maybe is familiar with it. UFAW had been established under a slightly different name at the University of London in 1926 by a British Army captain, later Major, Charles Wesley Hume. Hume believed that issues of animal welfare should be handled with a maximum of science and a maximum of sympathy for animals, but a minimum of sentimentality. He was not opposed to animal research. He wasn't an anti-vivisectionist, but he wanted to make it more humane. And over succeeding decades, UFAW focused on a variety of animal welfare issues, humane animal trapping methods, the use of cruelty-free perfumes, and the use of animals in films, for example, making sure they were handled humanely. UFAW's first substantial foray into the field of laboratory animal welfare appears to have been the publication of their now famous handbook on the care and management of laboratory animals, which was first published in 1947. The first, as far as we can tell, really guide to the husbandry of laboratory animals, and of course, it's still being published today. Now, in the early 1950s, though, UFAW, or really Hume, who almost basically was UFAW at the time, decided to move beyond issues of just animal husbandry to tackle the much more controversial subject of experimental techniques used on animals in the lab. By this time, 1950s, the number of animals, of course, used in laboratories had increased substantially with the dramatic growth in biomedical research following the Second World War. And this development concerned Hume and other animal welfare activists because they saw the number of animals being used greatly increasing. In the 1959 lecture, Hume pointed out that British experimenters were using, and as he estimated, quote, possibly 500,000 rats and some 2 million mice every year. And he expressed a worry in this lecture that this large number of animals that they're using might get some people working with them kind of so used to working with animals that, as he said, it might make an experimenter begin to think of animals as if they were things and of no more consequence than a test tube. And so he decided he needed to do something about this. Now, he had already begun to express concerns about some animal experimentation practices by the end of the 40s. He was one of the co-signer of a letter to The Lancet in 1949 that criticized certain recent papers that described Canadian and American experiments, which he said were calculated to inflict the maximum of injury consistent with the temporary survival of the animals, which were then studied physiologically. The signers of the letter emphasized they were not questioning the importance of animal experimentation, but rather the particular procedures used in the experiments they cited. In that same year, U4 published Hume's pamphlet called How to Befriend Laboratory Animals. In this work, Hume touches on some of the issues, actually, that later get incorporated into the 3 R's. For example, he discussed the importance of reducing the number of animals used in research through things like statistical analysis and better experimental design. And he also talked about choosing methods that would cause the least suffering for animals. As early as March 1953, Hume informed U4 and its executive committee that for some time he had been taking soundings on the subject of research on the humanitarian aspects of experimental techniques. Although he indicated this was not likely to become urgent until the right combination of research worker, facilities, and funds should materialize. But somehow, a few months later, by September of that year, he felt he was ready to move forward with a project along these lines, obtained the approval of the executive committee for U4 to advertise for a research fellow on the subject of humanitarian aspects of experimental methods. And in a statement published about the proposed project in May 1954, U4 commented that the research worker who would head such an effort, quote, would need practical wisdom and tact. And the following month, they received an application from a young zoologist named W.M.S Russell, who they eventually hired. Now, Russell had graduated with honors in 1948 from Oxford, where he began his studies in classics, but after the interruption of the war, when he came back, he switched to zoology. Then he proceeded to undertake graduate research on the mating behavior of the African clawed frog in the laboratory, at one of the laboratories at Oxford, in the Department of Zoology and Comparative Anatomy, and received his D.Phil in 1952. At the time of his application to U4, though, he was working as an agricultural council research fellow at Oxford. He may have learned of the position from Peter Medawar, of course, later Nobel laureate, because Medawar had served as his tutor in zoology when he was at Oxford. And that also probably counted in his favor. Another factor that likely influenced U4 in his favor was that during his graduate work, he had developed with Richard Murray a more humane method of killing the frogs involved in their study. In fact, they published a brief note on this in U4's Courier in 1951. So in October 1954, Russell is hired on a year-to-year contract to, as the contract stated, undertake research into the history and progress of the introduction of humane methods into biological research with a view to encouraging further such progress. He was to work in close connection with a consultative committee, which had Medawar as its chair. Also had William Lane Petter, who was head of the Laboratory Animal Bureau, as honorary secretary. He was also honorary secretary of the Research Society, and also Christine Stevens, founder of the American Welfare Institute in the United States, because Christine had helped to fund this project, had donated to U4. Russell immediately convinces U4 that he needs an assistant for the project, and you managed to get the approval of the committee, and that person hired, as you know, was Rex Burch. Now, as envisioned by UFAW, there were two main techniques to be employed in the work. One would be a historical study of the literature of experimental biology and a survey of present trends in the field. Russell was going to undertake that aspect of the work. The second part of this was going to be a look at what was happening in laboratories in Britain, what kind of experimental techniques were used, when some of these techniques might actually appear to be more humane than others, and to collect this information to figure in the final report. Burch was tasked with conducting that survey under the supervision of Russell and the consultative committee, which would involve him personally visiting laboratories and interviewing scientists. They decided to focus particularly on bioassay to limit the scope of this because of the time that would be available, because they felt that more animals were being used in a bioassay than in pure research, so they began with that. Early in the project, Burch made a tentative approach to the University of Cambridge about interviewing people there. But when he did, it became obvious to him that, as he said, we're going to have to observe the usual formalities. We're going to have to go through department heads and get their blessing before I can interview any members of the department. He prepared a brief draft letter to be signed by Russell, who was head of the project, that basically just mentioned that Burch was assisting on a U4 project on humane practices and requesting permission for him to interview members of the department who were doing relevant research. Now, our colleague and good friend Michael Balls has already pointed out and mentioned in his lecture the other day that in this draft letter that Burch prepared, he appears to have been the first to use the term alternatives in connection with humane experimental methods. Burch had altered the original wording of his draft to change a sentence which stated that UFA hoped that they might be able to suggest improvements in laboratory procedures as a result of this study. And Burch, there's handwritten comments by Burch on the type draft where he suggests changing improvements to some possible alternatives. But when Russell gets the draft, he crosses out possible alternatives, and he instead writes that UFA hoped to produce a review of progress in the development of humane techniques. Hume also agreed with Russell that they should not use the term alternatives. He was concerned that using a term like alternatives might create a kind of defensive attitude on the part of scientists of, who are you to tell me how to do my job? And so alternatives was not used. In any case, 22 letters were sent to selected departments of pharmacology, biochemistry, physiology, etc. And the replies began to come in. Russell urged Burch to read all these letters also, and they came in carefully, and adjust his behavior accordingly. There's a lot of concern about, they wanted to not, sort of antagonize the scientists who they were interviewing. Russell instructed Burch to be especially careful in discussing the psychological aspects of the study. And by this he meant, and all of you who've read the book will know, that there was a section which talked about the attitudes, psychological attitudes of experimenters, and how this might impact their experimental techniques. Russell says this topic should be introduced with caution after you have sized up the individual department member. In December, Russell submitted a progress report to the executive committee, and there was also a short piece published about the project in the U4 Courier. Russell emphasized in this piece the need to collect these information, particularly about humane techniques that were already in use, to make them better known. And he talked about his belief that it was important to study not only the techniques, but how the complex attitude of individuals towards the lower animals interact with all the other variables. Now, in addition to the literature research and the interviews with the scientists, U4 project also involved, to some extent, encouraging and supporting work by scientists in the development of humane methods, particularly their support of the work of people like Phyllis Croft and Michael Chance, but I won't go into detail on this. At the annual U4 meeting in February 1955, Russell gave his first public presentation on the project. And one of the things he said, humanity in the biological sciences can increase in two ways. First, increasing humane procedures can be developed so that animals actually studied are exposed to less and less pain, fear, and discomfort. And we can may increase in our field of humanity in experimentation by the reduction of the number of animals used in biological research. And clearly here he's talking about the principles we would call reduction and refinement. He also made reference to what is essentially the concept of replacement, although he listed it as a sort of subcategory of reduction. I guess if you reduce the number to zero, that's reduction. And he talked about how we might do reductions, but again, time limits me from going into detail here. The first specific mention of the 3 R's was made by Russell at a U4 symposium on humane techniques in the laboratory at University of London on May 8, 1957. Russell gave 2 papers at that conference, the main one of which was the one that clearly expressed for the first time the concept of the 3 R's, identified in the title, the increase of humanity in experimentation, replacement, reduction, and refinement. In spite of his use of those terms, he actually didn't specifically refer to them in the paper as the 3 R's. It was rather Peter Medawar, in his foreword to the published volume, who seems to have been the first to use the term in print when he referred to Russell's 3 R's of humane practice. Both Russell and Burch have said later, as I think most of you know, they couldn't really recall exactly how they came up with the terms. I think, again, I refer to my friend Michael Balls, who suggested a possible place for this as he was going through some of those documents in the Russell archive we heard about. There was a page in these papers that contained a story by an author named Ursus, which we know is a pen name for Russell that he used in his science fiction writings. And next to that story was an advertisement for United Steel Companies entitled The 3 R's of Industries, 3 R's of Industry. So it does seem, you know, this was right next to Russell's story. He must have been aware of it. And he decided to take this page out of the journal and put it in his archive. So it's certainly suggestive, though we can't know for sure. In 1959, Russell completes the manuscript based on the work of Burch and himself. It's published by Methuen, as you know, as the Principles of Humane Experimental Technique. And the U4 annual report for that year expressed the hope that the deep thinking which has gone into this work will inaugurate a new era in biological research in which the systematic study of problems in humane experimental technique will rank as an essential part of every biologist's training. However, of course, it was to take decades before the concept really took root, but the concept of the 3 R's eventually did come to help shape the whole field of alternatives, but I'm going to have to leave it to others to discuss the later developments. I've only been able to give you a very brief review of the origins of the 3 R's, which I hope to be able to expand on in a book I'm working on the history of alternatives. And I hope I've given you at least some insights into the origins. Thank you.